Today on the Roundhouse, we are again talking with Wick Moorman, this time about Amtrak. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to The Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozerak, and this is episode number 96 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. Today is part 2 of our conversation with former CEO and president of Norfolk Southern, as well as former CEO of Amtrak. This time, we're talking to him about his time with Amtrak, as well as what he's looking forward to with the East Broad Top, of which he's a part. Before we get into the interview, I just want to briefly add a caveat that this was recorded in March 2020, so it's maybe not the most up-to-date as far as being able to include conversation about the coronavirus or the incoming CEO of Amtrak as of 2020, but there's still a lot that is relevant to looking at Amtrak in this day and age. I want to thank today's sponsor, Age of Steam Roundhouse, and congratulate them on acquiring Reading Camelback locomotive number 1187. You could see their collection at ageofsteamroundhouse.org and buy tickets for the 2020 season there. In 2015, you retire from Norfolk Southern. You hand the baton to Jim Squires. Then in 2016, it's announced that you've stepped up to be the CEO of Amtrak. What led you to decide to come out of retirement?
Well, it wasn't my wife, I can tell you that. She hated it. I had somehow, early in 2016, become aware, I guess it was in the news magazine somewhere, that Boardman would be leaving Amtrak in the fall. And I got a call to go up. They asked me, the chairman of the Amtrak board, Tony Kosha, whom I did not know, asked if I would come up and have lunch with him in Washington, which I did. I got on the train in Charleston, went up, had a nice lunch with Tony and a couple of other people, one of whom I do know, who were on the board. And so I've told the story a million times, they kind of said, Joe Boardman's leaving, we need to look for a new CEO. What kind of person should we be looking for? And I essentially said, look, I'm not trying to blow my own horn, but you'd kind of like to find somebody who looks like me, the CEO of a big railroad. I know something about Amtrak. I know something about Capitol Hill, on and on and on. And of course, I was telling something they'd already figured out a long time ago. And they said, great, what about it? I said, no, I'm not looking for a full-time job. And they ran a search process, which did not go well. And so Tony calls me back and says, look, would you just come up for a little while to help us to get us through this? And we had a lot of conversation, and I had a lot of conversation with my wife. And at the end of the day, I agreed to go up for what I initially said would be no more than 6 months to help them out as CEO. And that's how it happened.
Since you knew that you were only going to fill that role for a specific period of time, what were your goals?
They're pretty easy. One was start to fix what I could fix in the short term, and help them find a longer-term CEO. That was kind of it. That's pretty broad. I didn't know what I was getting into or what needed to be fixed. I was sure there were things that needed to be fixed. But that was the whole intent of going up there.
How is leading Amtrak similar and different from Norfolk Southern?
Well, I mean, there are just certain things about being the CEO, particularly of a railroad company, that are the same, right? That's just the way the jobs work. But it was different in a number of ways. The first of which was it needed a lot of fixing. Norfolk Southern was a well-run company when I became CEO. Amtrak had substantial problems of all kinds, which were pretty obvious. So there was a lot to do. There were people that really just needed to leave. There were other good people, and there are a lot of good people there, but who maybe were in the wrong slot. They were spending a lot of money on some things, which were not as important as things that they weren't spending money on, and a lot of their processes needed to be improved around budgeting, capital budgets, things like that. So that was all very different. The other thing, it's not a public company, right? I never had to look at the price, so that was better. I had the board NS, but I had a board who was very happy that I was at Amtrak, and so I basically had an attitude, and this will sound peculiar, but I told people this, where, as things moved along, and we had some things happening, had kind of big set of issues in New York around Penn Station, and my attitude always was, well, what are you going to do? Fire me? So I just did what I think was right. And it's not that I didn't do things that I think was right at NS, but I was much more carefree about doing them at Amtrak for whatever reason. It just felt different. I didn't worry about the politics. I didn't worry about things where if you're in a longer term role in a publicly traded company, you would at least have to think harder about them.
The impression that I remember having when I saw the news that you were going into this leadership, it was that this was, and feel free to disagree with me if this is an incorrect assessment, but almost kind of a civic service, because Amtrak is an important lifeline, especially for some Western communities, and the Northeast Corridor is a vital piece of infrastructure in and of itself. So it seems to me that part of what you were setting out to do, and from what you've said, was that once you learned what was going on from the inside and coming with your extensive knowledge already, you had a sense of, here's things that I can bring to the table, and this is what I'm going to do for this period of time, love it or hate it, but I'm going to do what I feel is in the best interest of Amtrak's sustainability. Would you say that's accurate?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I always tell people there are three reasons I did it. The first is I thought it, and still think, and I've been thanked by a whole lot of people for doing it, is it was public service without having to go to work for the government. So paperwork is known for the past 30 years. And then I thought, I kind of thought I could do this thing. My ego got carried away with me. And I believe there were people who had been writing, Wick Moorman would be perfect for the job. I thought, well, hell, maybe that's not such a noble thing to think. And I did think I could do it. I did think I was qualified to do it. So, yeah, but certainly the public service piece of it was important to me. And what I enjoyed, I loved every minute of it. It was great.
Even the media circus, it seems to me that they were pretty relentless on you, as they are with anybody running the show at Amtrak.
But remember, I didn't care, right? So we did this big press conference in the middle of Penn Station after we had the two derailments up there, which I basically said, these are our fault and I apologize. And we're going to fix this thing. which led to further outrage later. But, while I was doing that, I was thinking, hey, I've never done anything like this before. This is interesting, right? It didn't, it kept me on my toes. No, I had a good time. I had a very good time doing it. And there's some great people up there whom I think the world of. And it's an interesting job because, and I've said this to people before, the interesting thing about Amtrak is that there are strategic issues in the freight railroad, but most of them have been thought through thoroughly for years and years and years. And you may decide that you need to alter the rudder because you've got to steer towards the intermodal business more or something like that. The strategic issues around Amtrak and what it is now and what it should be are huge, and they have all kinds of bearing on all kinds of things. Like, well, what are we going to do about locomotives? What are we going to do about equipment? What do we really need? How should we be organized to respond to this? Those are just fun issues to deal with.
When you look at the direction Amtrak has gone, because you knew that you weren't going to be able to solve all of those issues in the span of your tenure, and honestly, it's the type of thing that it seems like will span the tenure of multiple CEOs. Do you think it has gone a significant way to improving what you were seeing as the core issues and the way that the vision that you had?
Oh, yeah. Listen, I got some stuff started and that we did some good things. And one of the best things we did, and it's because he had his hand up and volunteered too, was get Richard Anderson. And Richard Anderson is an outstanding chief executive officer. He's a guy who took Delta from bankruptcy, most admired domestic carrier. And so he knows, I think I used it once already. The phrase I always use is, I may not be good, but I know what good looks like. And Richard knows exactly what good looks like when it comes to hauling people. And the place where I knew I did not have the skill sets that Richard has and has brought people in who clearly have them in spades is passenger operations, right? Hauling people around. So when you look at Amtrak today, and I know there's controversy about him, and so be it. I think I would tell you I agree with 95% of everything he's done. But it's a far better run company and organization than it was when I walked in the door. There's just no question. Look at their last year's results, right? The lowest ever operating loss and on the way to not losing money in operations. Ridership up substantially for the first time in a while. They're doing really good things. And they have really good people in leadership roles. Yeah. So, and as I say, Richard doesn't necessarily try to endear himself to everyone, but he knows what good looks like, and he was all about making Amtrak good.
As you said, his tenure has proven controversial. One question that I've discussed with private car owners on the show before, and Brad Lawrence raises this, do you believe that Amtrak's revised private cars / special train policy was a prudent decision? And would you have taken similar action had you remained as CEO?
I would have gotten to, I would have been slower about it and maybe tried to be a little softer about it, but I would have gotten to a lot of the same places ultimately. And I'll tell you why. Special trains, and Richard had this attitude about at Delta too. People who worked with him there told me, he kind of looks at this idea of special trains and says, as a business, why are we doing that, right? If you look at particularly, let's say, stands that Amtrak would run, the only reason the Class 1s want Amtrak in there is the insurance coverage, right? The $200 million, $250, whatever it is right now, liability cap. But they stand to run their own and just cover it with their insurance. We ran the NS theme specials on our insurance coverage, and it didn't go much. So, but then you say to yourself, okay, Amtrak is a publicly owned company with a certain mission. Why is it that the American public should be bearing the potential liability of running steam specials? It's difficult to make that case. And in the case of, and particularly in the case of after the accident in Washington, right, where you're saying we've got significant issues to fix with our own people, why would we be running any specials outside of our normal operating territory? Now, you can say, well, you have people there, blah, 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 but it's a rational argument to say, no, that's what Amtrak should be doing. The private cars, you know, the fact of the matter is, and I was seeing it too, there's a certain percentage of private car owners that really didn't follow our rules, that weren't particularly good about things like alcohol. We had said we really don't want you sitting back on the back platform on an open platform car when you're rocking along at speed, and people would ignore that. And that wasn't the majority, but there was a set of people in there who were high maintenance and didn't necessarily follow our rules. And the other fact of the matter is, and this was what Richard said, is why am I delaying paying customers at a stop where there's no time scheduled and the train may be late already to handle that private car on and off the train? So he said, yeah, we'll handle private cars, but only where there's time in the timetable to allow it, which pretty much says origin and destination and a few other people. And that's a rational thing to do. I understand there are people that might not like it, but of the Amtrak ridership, right? The vast majority of them are going to look at it and say, well, yeah, that makes sense. Why on earth would you do that? That's just, it's a hard truth, but it is the truth.
That's an interesting way to think of it, especially the accountability to the taxpayer element of it. I mean, you look at the phrase and you hear the phrase, the American people, thrown around so much, but it's true that when Amtrak relies so much on federal subsidy, there is an element of that accountability that has to be considered when making those decisions, which is a difficult one to balance in line with also wanting to satisfy as many subsets of the public as possible.
But remember this about the car. And listen, I own a car, right? I'm personally affected by this, if you will. One of the arguments is the incremental revenue, right? It's like free money. That may be true, but I looked at it 2 years ago. And private revenue was like $4 million in a multi-billion-dollar organization. It's not enough it wasn't even a rounding error, right? So the money isn't important. And then the hassle effort and the exposure from what is a tiny community at the end of the day. And they're really great people, and I understand all of that. And I like them, and I love to see these cars. I'm a passenger car guy. But, you know, if you look at it from a business, if you don't look at it from anything but a business standpoint, which is how Richard Anderson looked at it, his first question, why would we be doing this? Particularly if we're delaying trains to do it. Great question. Not a great answer to it. I may be becoming one of the most hated people ever to appear on your podcast, Nick, but I mean, that's kind of the way it is.
No. I appreciate your perspective on it, because honestly, that's the thing, is that you saw it as best as anybody, and that's what you bring to the table. And I think it's important, and whether people agree or disagree with you, you were there and you saw the numbers and the decimal points for yourself. It's your perspective on it, and people have theirs. Like, everybody has their own perspective on private car travel, whether it be the business side, whether it be kind of the emotional, personal side, the public relations side, the community side. It's just an interesting thing to explore. I personally hold no hatred against you for that answer.
All right, so here is my editorial. There is one thing that irritates me more than anything else about Amtrak, and that is this ongoing theory, conspiracy theory, on the part of people who should know better, that somehow or another Amtrak's accounting systems are rigged so as to make the long-distance network look worse and the Northeast Corridor look better. And it's a ludicrous theory. And it's not only ludicrous because I say so. Amtrak has public accountants that look at all of this, and they say so. That the system was not designed by Amtrak. It was designed by the FRA. And when I read these things, it just drives me around the wall. And people who should know better, people who write for Trains magazine, right? I saw something the other day, Amtrak's unverified accounting system. What? Are you kidding? So help me spread the word that you may not like kind of like private cars. You may not like everything that comes out of Amtrak, but their numbers are real. And the sad fact is that when you do all of the accounting, network accounting, just like every freight railroad does it, like every telecom company does it, and you do that accounting, if you look at all the costs, the Northeast Corridor is not profitable on a GAAP basis. And it requires an enormous amount of capital investment, but it generates cash above the top of the rail. And the long distance trains lose a lot of money. Just the way it is. Sorry. And for people who say, well, that's not true, why do you think Amtrak exists? It exists because private companies who were running passenger trains, long distance trains, which is where Amtrak started, were losing their shirts at a time when the railroad industry couldn't afford it. So that's my sermon, my pet peeve.
Do you think that in the long run, Amtrak is going to be able to keep those long distance routes viable?
Well, listen, this is a political equation, and I understand that, right? Amtrak needs a system where they get the support of the Congress and Congress people across the country. And they need that because otherwise the single most important infrastructure project in this country, period, the Gateway project, to put 2 new tunnels under the Hudson and do all of the other work that's needed up there, won't be funded. So, and if losing money on the long distance trains is what it takes, then maybe that's what it takes. But it's not a great idea. And if you're concerned, and you mentioned this earlier, is providing a transportation service to small rural communities, particularly across the West, there are much cheaper, better ways to do that than run long distance trains. Sorry.
Some have talked about the nature of the aging infrastructure on the Northeast Corridor, especially when it comes to Hudson River tunnels, the Baltimore Tunnel, things like that. Do you see an environment that will be conducive to bring forth the funding to really maximize the efficiency and hopefully free up those bottlenecks a bit, make them a bit more up to date and competitive?
Not right now. Not in the political environment today. No, simple answer is no. And there's a lot of work. It's the big projects, right? The corridor's getting better. We're doing more undercutting. We've got good things going on. The engineering department's much better than it was in terms of executing the maintenance plan every year. There are good things going on in terms of kind of the track work. But the B&P tunnel, the Susquehanna River Bridge, the Hudson tunnel, eventually adding capacity to Penn Station, which is beyond full every day. Those things are going to require major funding. But if you don't do that, the whole Northeast Corridor region, from an economic standpoint, is going to have a huge impact. Right? Yeah, people can't really go to work in New York from New Jersey and Long Island without the railroad.
Is there a way to bring people back, and by people I mean the general public, into the romance of rail travel? The Amtrak, especially in its early years, struggled because of having all the hand-me-down equipment, any sort of post-war negativity that surrounded the stigma of rail travel, and it's climbed out of that tremendously since then. Does it ever get to a point, certainly not maybe it's the height as it was during the 40s or 50s, but to a point where it becomes more on people's minds, and the argument I hear a lot of people make when I talk to coworkers and so forth who are less familiar on trains are, the rail systems of Europe, they've got it right. And obviously Europe is a completely different animal than we are, but railroads are in their lexicon. They're in the forefront there. And is there a way in which railroads regain that prominence and people traveling on them in North America?
I think the answer is yes, but it requires a complete rethinking of what you mean by train travel. It's not, in my estimation, sporadic long-distance trains, right? It's starting to focus, and there's some real problems with this around the host railroads, amongst other things, in saying, okay, what does Europe really do well? Well, it's really effective in commuters and in city pairs, right? So an example on NS, there's a very good rationale for having, 3, 4, whatever the number is, trains a day in both directions from Atlanta to Charlotte. There's much better rationale for that than running one a day overnight between Atlanta and Washington. A great example of it is I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the state, there are 2 trains through there, the Crescent, which on-time performance doesn't make it particularly reliable, and a state-sponsored train, which comes out of Roanoke up to Lynchburg and then goes on into D.C. And that Charlottesville, Washington train is full all the time. People would much rather be on that train than drive into Washington, D.C. That's the kind of thing where, as it becomes more and more established, which will be slow, but if it can be more and more established, where people are going to say, oh, this is great. The people who ride the train from Charlottesville to Washington and back love it because they don't want to be in a car. They can be on Wi-Fi, they can work, they can do all kinds of things. That's the role for the railroads in the future, for Amtrak.
Being hub-centered, and especially where there's that opportunity to get people effectively into a metropolis or into a large city and sell that advantage over road transport?
Yeah, or between cities. Yeah, over road transport and air transport. The Northeast Corridor, right? In terms of, it has like 70 or 80% market share of business travel between Washington and New York. Who in their right mind wants to drive into Manhattan from Washington? The answer is nobody. And nobody really wants to go to Dulles and fly up there and then go through LaGuardia, which is just terrible, and get a taxi into the city. You haven't saved much time, if any, by doing that. And if you get on the regional or even better, the Acela, it's a fine experience. And the new Acelas are going to be here shortly. They're beautiful trains.
I've been seeing some of the photos of them rolling out to Pueblo for testing. They look like they're going to be fantastic. as far as being able to keep that core strong Northeast corridor service cutting edge against short airline travel?
And we compete well not as well because it's a slower trip, but we compete well between New York and Boston. Where we don't compete particularly well is Boston to Washington. It just takes too long. Their air is a pronounced advantage, just from the time standpoint.
Do you see any future in which onboard meal service makes a return? Because that's been another point of controversy. Obviously, it saves costs, but it does come at some expense of customer experience, you could say, if people are expecting that. Do you see a return for that, or do you see that becoming a new normal?
Well, I think, they're experimenting with different ways to provide meal service, but, here's the simple fact. So Amtrak, I forget, loses a lot of money on meal service. And there's actually a law on the book that they have to eliminate that deficit, I think, by next year. I mean, it's a law, not just a good idea, right? So what do? And in particular, what's happened to Amtrak meal service, this is no surprise, is that it's included in first-class fares. So all of the sleeping car passengers and first-class passengers eat in the diner. Nobody else does. Because Amtrak food is A, expensive, and B, by and large, not very good. I mean, that's just a fact. So what do, right? And listen, again, I'm not trying to be aggressive about this. I used to eat on the Southern diners. It was a great experience. It's still a great experience. Ride along, have a meal, perfect. But A, it loses a lot of money, and there's a mandate, a law that says you got to stop losing money. And B, as I say, because so many cuts have already been made in order to try and lessen the deficit and prices raised, it's expensive and not particularly good. I thought that you can't get a good meal from time to time on Amtrak, but you can get a lot of mediocre meals. And you say, boy, if you paid for the same meal in a restaurant and paid the same price, you would not go back to that restaurant.
For people who want to have the rail travel of yesteryear experience, if Amtrak is moving in a direction that it's not going to be financially viable to have that type of experience, they want to have the dining car experience, or they want to have the vintage streamliner experience, that the way that they're going to be able to have that is if they rally around operations, companies, nonprofits that own private cars that are in positions to move them from terminal to terminal so that they'll continue to remain safe under Amtrak, which is to say that they won't cause Amtrak to lose money. Hence, those will continue to be a part of the business. Is the point being, should they rally around terminal operations so that still remains a viable part of Amtrak's business?
In terms of being able to ride on equipment where someone does provide that type of service, here's the thing about it, right? You can do that. You can do it today, right? You can ride across the country, find a private car owner, and they'll hook them up, and they pay whatever they pay a mile now, and you can do all of that. It's expensive, right? Amtrak, whether people think so or not, it's a bargain. I mean, the food is expensive, but you can also say, well, gee, but I get to ride along and look at the scenery, and this is great. But if you really want to do it, but Amtrak's not making money on it. They're not making money on the long distance trains. So who else is going to stand up and do that when it's guaranteed, absolutely guaranteed to lose money?
So something like the Autumn Colors Express excursion, which is run from Huntington to Hinton, if Amtrak continues to do that, it is doing that solely out of a generosity factor.
No, if they're doing that, I'm not familiar with that one. By and large, they will do a few. The only reason to do them is do they generate cash in the short term? Right. Amtrak is essentially it generates GAAP accounting. You can go look it up online, but it's basically it's something general. Are we using assets? And when we fully load the cost of the assets in the cruise, we come out cash ahead. Then you might take a look at it. But then there are all the other restrictions we talked about. This is a rabbit hole you can go down. I'm just telling you that, when you start looking at stuff forget the romance and the history and bless me, this is pleasant riding on the rails kind of thing, and look at it from a business, you look at it with different eyes. And at the end of the day, when you go read the Amtrak charter and when you read, what Amtrak has charged Amtrak with, what Congress has charged Amtrak with, they've charged it to run as a business. It's chartered as a for-profit corporation. So if you put a business person in, that's how they're going to run it. And if you don't put a business person in, then it's going to turn into a very poorly run organization, which is good for nobody.
It's a different way of thinking about it, but I appreciate you sharing that perspective.
Well, it kind of goes back to some of the things we've been talking about. Do I have an appreciation for all of this? Sure, right? But at the end of the day, I'm brought up and think about business like a business person. And that's what you have to run Amtrak. Believe me, I walked into a place that had not been run well as a business. And it just wasn't good. It wasn't getting anything done.
And you've shown through your experience with Norfolk Southern that there's times for tightening and focusing on the core mission, and then there's times when you get to do the
other stuff. Yeah, but as long as if there's a reason why it enhances the brand, sure, you can do the other stuff. But here's the thing: you don't think about that stuff until you've got a company that's running really well. The first thing you do is you tighten everything up. And that's what Richard's done. And when you tighten it up, numbers show it, numbers of passengers show it, the customer service surveys, the customer service index, the numbers are all up, right? People are happier, doing a better job of onboard announcements. That's important, right? Started reserve seats on Acela in first class. People worried about it, and then everybody said, that's the greatest thing they ever did. Bathrooms are cleaner. This started while I was there. We redone all the Amfleet interiors, done a big refresh on them. The vast majority, the overwhelming majority of people who ride Amtrak, that's the stuff they care about.
It's easy to forget the world is not populated by people who are going to be endlessly sympathetic to trains.
That's right. There are a lot of people who want to be sympathetic to trains, but they're not going to put up with a shabby interior and a dirty bathroom and not knowing what's going on. Their sympathy evaporates very quickly.
And the safety as well.
Exactly. Yeah. The safety culture at Amtrak, when I got there, was... And that's the slowest and hardest thing to fix.
Age of Steam Roundhouse, a true treasure of railroad preservation, is back for its second public season. This is a brand new roundhouse with nearly 24 steam locomotives on display in Sugar Creek, Ohio. The facility features an 18-stall, accurately reconstructed brick roundhouse surrounding a 115-foot turntable, the largest private collection of steam locomotives in the world, and a fully functioning, working back shop where skilled staff actively restore and repair steam locomotives. The railroad is open for tours this summer and fall and is taking all necessary precautions to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Tours of the Roundhouse and shop area will be offered Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, July through October. Tickets must be purchased in advance on their website at ageofsteamroundhouse.org. If you haven't seen it yet, visit ageofsteamroundhouse.org and follow them on social media. You have this sort of civic mindedness that you brought to Amtrak in your time there. You serve on a number of different boards of organizations as well. Duke Energy, the East Broad Top Foundation, which is the big one we're going to get to in a moment. But before that, one of the ones that struck me as interesting is that you're on the board for Focused Ultrasound Foundation. What is that organization and what drew you to their mission?
That's a very cool little organization. There is, it was set up by a neurosurgeon who was at the University of Virginia. And Focused Ultrasound is essentially taking ultrasound technology and using specific devices and sometimes multiple devices that can be targeted very precisely anywhere in the body. And it holds all kinds of promise. And the foundation was formed to accelerate the learning and the implementation of this particular technology. And so one good example, although there are all kinds of places to use it, is you can actually focus this in such a way that you can go into a very specific tiny spot in the brain and burn out a few cells. Just heat them up very locally, burn them out. And it turns out, and this is FDA approved, that it's a great treatment for treating people who have serious tremors as they get older. Right? So anyway, the physician who runs it, I met him. He's a very interesting guy. Has a lot of blue chip people in the Virginia area working with him, and it's a great cause. I'm happy to be part of it.
Mike Hune asks, what caught your interest in the East Broad Top Railroad?
Oh, that's a crazy story. I have a friend I've known for a good long while now up in Pennsylvania named Bennett Levin. And Bennett, very successful, had his own engineering practice, then was building commissioner? Anyway, in Philadelphia, has been active in state of Pennsylvania politics and things like that, and also as a rail guy, right? Owns, I'm sure you know, owns a couple of E units and PRR colors and a few cars, including the office car that I forget what the initials are, not car one, which they used to transport Bobby Kennedy's body on the funeral train. So anyway, Bennett and I have been interested and are both now on the board of the Railroaders Memorial Museum in Altoona. And the Altoona Museum is a wonderful little museum for anybody who's ever been there. And it also owns the K4, which is in pieces over there. And there have been some efforts underway to put the K4 back together, and those efforts are continuing, and Bennett and I are part of that. And anyway, I'd always heard about the East Broad Top and really didn't know much about it. But he and I had talked about it over the past couple of years, and he said, we'll go up and look, and you can meet, he knows Jim who owned it. It's past it now. And then in the meantime, another guy I know in the railroad business named Henry Posner in Pittsburgh, he and I were talking, and he has gotten involved with, as a counselor to a group who were putting together plans to try and purchase and restore the East Broad. And led by a very good guy, Brad CEO. this all just kind of came together. And I had never been to Orbitsonia. I went to Orbitsonia like for the first time 4 months ago or something. I went with Bennett and Henry and met Brad there. And I just walked around and I was just stunned by what I saw. I mean, I was just amazed. You know, I'm sure a lot of your listeners have seen it. I know you've seen it. It's just like nothing you've ever seen, right? There's a small town in the middle of it is this preserved gem. And so it all worked out. Right time, right place. Joe Kowalczyk, you've really done a great job in keeping this thing. And kind of, I think, decided that we were the right group to do something with it, to preserve it, and to honor the legacy of his father and mother who bought it, and the rest of him and the rest of the family. And so it just all came together. It's not something where, you know, I've not been a dedicated East Broad Top follower for years and years or anything like that. I just happened to be in the right place, right? I could help.
And it has a certain magic that when you see it for the first time and you're walking around the shop buildings and you're seeing how amazingly intact it is, there's just a way in which it feels so timed and timeless. And I feel like that's the thing that has communicated to so many people, that you can see photos of it, you can hear the stories, but when you actually go there and see it, it's a wholly separate matter. And it just has this gut punch.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's frozen in time. I'd never seen anything quite like it. And, you know, so I think having the opportunity to be part of the group that can help bring it back to life, you know, I'm just extremely happy to be part of that.
Andrew Green asks, with your addition onto the East Broad Top Foundation board, what steps are you encouraging the new organization to do first?
Well, there's a plan, and it will become public. You know, Brad Esposito is our general manager, and he's got some outstanding people helping down there, David Brightville and Lawrence B. Miller, to kind of, the goal is, and we'll just see how long it takes, right, is to start incrementally and put the first four and a half miles back in service, which is what was in service at the end, and start running some trips, probably with the diesel car first. Start working on getting a steam engine back in the car fleet. We're going to have to do a lot of track work, a whole lot of track work, and you know, slowly but surely, we got to pay for it still. We put a big down payment on, but there's still a lot of money to go and, you know, put it back in operation. It'll take years, but I think that it's a worthwhile initiative.
When you think of it, and now you being an advocate for it, try to explain it to other people and get them excited about what's going on, what stands out in your mind as far as the many things that you could describe? What's the thing where you go, that's distinct to this railroad?
There are two things I always talk about. The first is you walk in the roundhouse and you walk around the roundhouse, and here are 16 locomotives sitting there, and it doesn't take much imagination at all to imagine it as a working roundhouse with all the steam locomotives there ready to go. And then the second thing is the remarkable is the shop, right? You know, here are all these machines driven by leather belts, which are still hanging there, off rotating rods in the steel, driven by a steam engine, and a big blower that drives the steam engine. And it's totally authentic. right? This is not a recreation. This is the real thing. Those are the things I talk about.
Well, as a board member of the Friends of the East Broadtop, which is the nonprofit dating back to the 80s that has always worked to support whoever owned the railroad, I really appreciate you and your support with this. In particular, being able to go to train shows, post announcement, and say, oh, yes, this has, if you're familiar with Bennett Levin, Henry Posner, Wick Moorman, these are the guys who are supporting it. Your name in rail preservation and the industry does a lot to help communicate the significance of this railroad. And that's something that I personally am really appreciative of.
Well, it's very kind of you to say that. I hear that. I'm not sure I always understand it, but that's a nice thing to hear. But I will say, too, the Friends have been a remarkable organization. The reason the place is still out there and in as good a shape as it is the work of the Friends over the past number of years, a significant number of years. It's a great organization, and to everyone who's listening, if you are not a member of the Friends of the East Broadtop, you should go online and sign up today.
I wholeheartedly support that message. I have a link in the show notes for that as well.
Yeah, I figured you would, Nick.
Well, there's a lot of good things to link out to that you've been involved with in one way or another. Question that comes from my mom of all people is, in your opinion, what do railroads need to do to be successful in the 21st century? Any new directions from what it took in the 20th century?
I think they have to ultimately focus on growth, and to me, the growth is you've got to get better and better in terms of consistency and timeliness of handling boxes, handling intermodal freight, because that's how freight is going to move, and you need to be equipped to do that. Make the necessary investments to do it. There'll always be bulk, right? There'll always be grain. There'll always be some steel traffic. There'll be chemical traffic. But if you're going to grow, it's going to be in boxes, and I believe that. That's, I think, what you have to do. The railroads have the great advantage, and no one, has ever figured out a more energy efficient way to move goods over the ground, right? The dynamics of the steel wheel and the steel rail are just unbeatable. Now, the other thing, though, that it sets the stage in this day and age for the railroads to more and more, and this is something that I talked about a long time ago, is to talk about our role in terms of carbon emissions and climate, because as you get more freight off the highway, you reduce emissions. And we, the freight industry, have customers who see that and respond to that. So I think there's a role for the railroads in the future. But the people who lead the railroads today and in the future are going to have to be like the people in the past. They're going to have to adjust and make the right decisions in order to be successful.
That's what I find interesting about being able to use something like the East Broadtop as a means of communicating that, because you look at people who've written about the history of it, it seems like a large reason why it survived when so many narrow gauge railroads didn't is because of the innovation that it had during its time as a common carrier, having steel cars, getting the most advanced steam locomotives. So the fact that you have something like that could showcase, here's what it meant to be a cutting edge railroad 100 years ago, and a railroad that survived because it learned to adapt, is something that rings true when you look at modern railroading, and that same philosophy of needing to adapt, needing to be there to support the customer base and the communities that surround that entity.
Oh, yeah. 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 You just have to constantly, it's what the world is in. Continuous change and trying to match that change and improve.
My last question for you today is, when people look back at all of the things that you've done in your career, in your retirement, how do you want to be remembered?
I don't know. I don't really give that a whole lot of thought. I guess I want to be remembered as whoever the obscure guy was that they named a yard for in Bellevue, Ohio.
Well, there's certainly that.
Yeah, I'm pretty. You know what? That's all I would ever aspire to. If you name a hump yard for me, and I don't think they'll close. I don't think they'll close Moorman Yard anytime soon.
It's your name on a piece of railroad infrastructure. There you go. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Wick, and sharing just a piece of your vast experience with everything that you've done with Norfolk Southern, with Amtrak, and now going into new adventures like the East Broad Top. I look forward to when we get to talk again, because it's been a great conversation, and I appreciate you sharing your perspective on all these topics with our listeners.
All right. Well, I appreciate you. Appreciate you letting me talk.
Since recording this interview, the yard has since downsized in terms of its operations, but Wick tells me he's still very happy to have a yard named after him.
And now, the question of the day.
In part one of our conversation with Wick, I asked you, what did you enjoy most about Wick Moorman's tenure as Norfolk Southern CEO, either as a fan or as an employee? A lot of you responded, shared some really interesting stories and experiences. Here's a few that I selected. First, from YouTube, Eric Trains Fan writes, for my answer to the question of the day, the thing that I most enjoyed about Wick's time of being the CEO is the heritage units. The first and only one I've seen at the time of this video's making is 8114, the original Norfolk Southern unit. On June 6th, my dad took me down to Bellevue, Ohio to railfan. Before we left, a manifest out of Bellevue Yard came rolling by the railfan canopy in the middle of the triangle, and 8114 was the fourth unit on that train. That memory will always stick with me, and I hope to see more in the future. Martin P. Spannon writes, trinkets, hats, keychains, mugs, train sets, clocks, tumbler, etc. Wick spoiled us with trinkets, and we love him for it. It's the little things sometimes that make people happy and show you care. He is a very nice man, I hear. I never got to meet him in person, and now I regret turning down my chance to be on the president's train. Just not my thing. However, everyone said he is very approachable and just like one of the guys. I respect that in a person. Ken Dar wrote, the heritage units, plus the fact that I got to service them and take care of them. And the Nickel Plate Road Historical and Technical Society wrote, sites like this one, referring to a photo that I'd posted on Facebook of the 21st Century Steam excursion out of Youngstown with 765. Last, from the roundhousepodcast.com, Richard writes, I'm going to be very blunt in my response to your question of the week. As an employee, I felt Wick really cared about other employees. We did not always see eye to eye, but he took the time to listen and answer our questions. I thought his Ask Wick employee forum was groundbreaking and showed his true management style. I also spoke with Wick face-to-face when he attended a function at Conway Yard. He took questions from the employees and provided answers. The current management team treats craft employees like we are completely expendable. We've gone from a company who cares about the safety and well-being of craft employees to a company who now only seems to care about what the wants and desires of the stockholders are. We now live every day with the fear that one mistake can get us fired, and that stress is no doubt leading to many mistakes and poor employee management relationships that did not exist when Wick was CEO. When I attended the training facility in McDonough, Georgia, when I was first hired, one of our trainers who had previously retired from the railroad with over 30 years service as a conductor told us all, take care of the railroad and the railroad will take care of you. I've tried to live by those words until last year. After seeing half of my fellow craft employees laid off because of precision-scheduled railroading, I no longer feel that is a true statement. Your question of the day for this episode is, what did you enjoy most about Wick Moorman's tenure as Amtrak CEO, either as a fan or as an employee? Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com. Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to check out our social media on Facebook and Twitter, and for supporting the Roundhouse for as long as you have. 5 years in, we're almost at 100 episodes, and we have some great adventures in store for you. Thanks for listening, and remember that the Roundhouse is our house.